Amelia Patterson clutched her handkerchief as the cold metal barrel of the revolver pressed against her back, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might drown out the steam engine's thunderous whistle. It was 1878 in Laredo, Texas, and her life was being hijacked as surely as the train she was being forced aboard. "Move, Miss Patterson. There ain't no place for you in this town no more," growled Jasper Holloway, the cattle baron who had tormented her family for years. His weathered face contorted with malice as his men flanked her on either side, herding her toward the departing locomotive like a lamb to slaughter. Amelia's chestnut hair whipped across her face as she struggled against their grip. At 23, she had never felt so helpless. Her father's ranch, their home for generations, had been seized just hours after his funeral. Now they were banishing her from the only home she'd ever known. "Please," she begged, digging her heels into the dirt platform. "Everything I love is in Laredo." "Should have thought of that before your pa borrowed money he couldn't repay," Holloway sneered. "This train's headed to San Antonio. Don't you ever think about coming back?" Through her tears, Amelia spotted a figure across the station. A tall man watching the scene unfold, his face partially obscured by a worn Stetson. Even at a distance, she could see the tension in his posture, like a coiled spring ready to release. "Get her on that train," Holloway barked as the locomotive began to inch forward. With a brutal shove, Amelia was propelled onto the boarding steps of the accelerating train. She grabbed the handrail to keep from falling, her reticule and a small satchel, all she had left in the world, clutched desperately in her other hand. The train lurched, gathering momentum, forcing her inside. Clayton Wilson had just returned to Laredo after 5 years of driving cattle and building a reputation as one of the finest horsemen in Texas. At 30, he'd finally saved enough to buy his own modest spread. He'd known Thomas Patterson, Amelia's father, and respected the man. Watching his daughter being manhandled onto a departing train by Holloway's thugs made his blood boil. Without a second thought, Clayton dropped his saddlebags and sprinted toward the tracks. The train was moving faster now, black smoke billowing from its stack. Clayton ran parallel to it, his long legs pumping, his duster flapping behind him like wings. "Stop that train," he shouted, but his voice was lost in the mechanical roar. Clayton made a split-second decision. Racing ahead of the engine, he planted himself directly on the tracks, legs spread wide, arms outstretched. His eyes locked with the startled engineers through the locomotive's window. "Are you mad?" the engineer yelled, pulling frantically on the brake lever. Metal screeched against metal as the massive wheels struggled to halt their forward momentum. Steam hissed angrily from the engine as it slowed. Passengers lurched in their seats, luggage tumbled from racks, and startled cries filled the cars. Clayton didn't move, even as the cow catcher came within feet of his body. Only when the train finally shuddered to a complete stop did he step aside, his heart hammering against his ribs. Holloway and his men watched in disbelief from the platform. "Wilson," Holloway bellowed. "You're interfering with private business." Clayton ignored him, striding purposefully alongside the train until he reached the car where Amelia stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. "Miss Patterson," he called up to her, tipping his hat. "I believe there's been a mistake. You're not meant to leave Laredo today." Amelia stared down at him, recognition dawning on her tear-streaked face. "Mr. Wilson, Clayton Wilson, the same," he confirmed with a slight nod. "Would you kindly step down from there? I have a proposition that might interest you concerning your father's land." "She ain't going nowhere," Holloway shouted, advancing toward them with his men in tow. "That train's leaving with her on it." Clayton's hand moved casually to rest on his holstered Colt. I reckon the engineer might disagree, seeing as I'm the only thing standing between him and a clear track. The standoff drew the attention of everyone at the station. Passengers peered through windows, and the station master wrung his hands nervously, clearly unwilling to intervene. "Miss Patterson," Clayton said, his eyes never leaving Holloway, "I knew your father. He was a good man who helped me when I first came to Texas. I'd be obliged if you'd let me return the favor." Amelia hesitated only briefly before descending the train steps. The moment her boots touched the ground, Clayton moved beside her, a silent wall of protection. "Holloway," Clayton addressed the fuming cattle baron, "I suggest you reconsider your actions. Forcing a lady onto a train against her won't sit well with Judge Carson." Holloway's face reddened. "The Patterson debt is legal and binding. I've got papers." "Funny thing about papers," Clayton replied evenly. "They sometimes don't tell the whole story. Thomas Patterson and I had an arrangement before he passed. I'd be happy to discuss it with the judge." It was a bluff, but Clayton delivered it with such confidence that doubt flickered across Holloway's face. The cattle baron stepped back, reassessing the situation. "This ain't over, Wilson," Holloway spat. "Not by a long shot." He motioned to his men, and they retreated toward town, casting venomous glances over their shoulders. As they disappeared from sight, Amelia turned to Clayton, her amber eyes searching his face. "There was no arrangement with my father, was there?" Clayton gave her a rueful smile. "No, madam, there wasn't, but Holloway doesn't know that." "Why would you help me?" she asked, clutching her satchel tightly. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Clayton replied. "Your father gave me my first job in Texas when no one else would hire a stranger, said he had a feeling about me." He glanced at the departing figures of Holloway and his men. "Besides, I never could abide a bully." The engineer leaned from his cabin window. "Are we clear to depart now, mister?" Clayton tipped his hat in acknowledgement. "All clear. Sorry for the inconvenience." As the train slowly began moving again, Amelia realized she was stranded, no home, no family, and only a stranger's kindness between her and destitution. "Mr. Wilson, I'm grateful, truly. But I have nowhere to go. Holloway seized our ranch this morning." Clayton retrieved his saddlebags from where he'd dropped them. "First things first, Miss Patterson, let's get you somewhere safe. Then we can figure out how to deal with Holloway." He offered his arm. "My horse is hitched outside the station. If you'll allow me, I can escort you to Mrs. Ramirez's boarding house. She's a good woman who won't ask too many questions." Amelia hesitated before accepting his arm. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson." "Clayton," he corrected gently. "Amelia," she replied with a tentative smile. As they walked through the station, Amelia knew that whatever came next, her life had irrevocably changed. The train that was supposed to carry her away from Laredo had instead delivered her to a crossroads, and to a man brave enough to stand on train tracks for a woman he barely knew. The sun was setting as Clayton guided his chestnut gelding through Laredo's dusty streets. Amelia perched sideways behind him on the saddle. She maintained a proper distance, her hands resting lightly on his sides, though the horse's gait occasionally pressed her closer than propriety might allow. "I apologize for the unconventional transportation," Clayton said over his shoulder. "I wasn't expecting company when I rode in today." "After nearly being forced from town at gunpoint, sharing a saddle seems a minor impropriety," Amelia replied, her voice steadier than she felt. They passed the Mercantile and the saloon, where piano music spilled onto the boardwalk along with raucous laughter. Amelia felt exposed, conscious of curious eyes following their progress. Laredo might be growing, but it was still small enough that gossip traveled faster than telegraph messages. Clayton sensed her discomfort. Not much further now. Mrs. Ramirez runs the cleanest boarding house in town. She'll look after you proper." "And then what?" Amelia asked quietly. "Holloway won't simply forget what happened today." "One problem at a time," Clayton advised. "First, we get you settled. Then we look at your father's papers, see what Holloway thinks gives him claim to your land." They arrived at a modest two-story house set back from the street, surrounded by a small garden that seemed almost defiant in the arid Texas landscape. Clayton dismounted and helped Amelia down, his hands strong but gentle at her waist. A plump woman with silver-streaked black hair opened the door before they could knock. "Clayton Wilson." "It has been too long since you graced my doorstep," she exclaimed, her accent lilting with her Mexican heritage. "Mrs. Ramirez," Clayton greeted her with genuine warmth. "I've brought someone who needs your hospitality." He introduced Amelia, explaining her situation in discreet terms. Sophia Ramirez's dark eyes softened with compassion. "Thomas Patterson's daughter. Of course she will stay here." She opened the door wider. "Come in, child. You look as though you haven't eaten in days." Inside, the boarding house was immaculate, with simple furnishings and the enticing aroma of beans, corn tortillas, and something sweet baking in the oven. Amelia's stomach reminded her that she hadn't eaten since before her father's funeral that morning. "I can offer you a small room at the back," Mrs. Ramirez said. "It is not fancy, but it is clean and quiet." "That's very kind," Amelia replied, "but I'm afraid I have little money to. We can settle accounts later," Mrs. Ramirez interrupted, waving away her concerns. "First, you will eat." Clayton cleared his throat. "I should be going. Got some business to attend to before nightfall." Amelia turned to him, suddenly anxious at the thought of his departure. "Will I see you again?" "I don't know how to begin fighting Holloway without—" "I'll return tomorrow morning," Clayton promised. "We'll sort through this together." He hesitated. "If that's agreeable to you." "Yes," she said quickly. "Thank you again for what you did today." After Clayton left, Mrs. Ramirez showed Amelia to her room, small as promised but spotlessly clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the garden. For the first time since her father fell ill, Amelia was surrounded by kindness rather than predatory opportunism. Over a simple but delicious meal, Amelia shared more details of her predicament with Mrs. Ramirez, who listened with increasing indignation. "Jasper Holloway has caused grief for many families," the older woman said darkly. "He believes money can buy anything: land, loyalty, even the law." "My father never mentioned borrowing money from him," Amelia confided. "We struggled after Mother died, especially when Father's health began failing, but he would have told me about a debt that could cost us everything." "Men sometimes shield their daughters from worry," Mrs. Ramirez observed. "But Clayton Wilson is a good man to have in your corner. He understands the ways of Texas justice." That night, alone in her narrow bed, Amelia tried to make sense of the day's events. She had buried her father, lost her home, nearly been forced from town, and been rescued by a man she barely remembered from her childhood. A man who had stood in front of a moving train to help her. Her thoughts turned to Clayton Wilson. She recalled him vaguely from years ago, a young, quiet cowhand who had worked for her father briefly, before moving on to bigger outfits. He had grown into his shoulders since then, his boyish features hardened by sun and experience into something more compelling. His eyes were the same, though clear, blue and direct, with a steadiness that had comforted her amid chaos. As exhaustion finally claimed her, Amelia realized she had put her trust and her future in the hands of a virtual stranger. She could only pray that her instincts and her father's judgment of character would prove sound. Meanwhile, Clayton Wilson was having a drink at the Broken Spoke Saloon, listening more than talking as he nursed his whiskey. The bartender, an old friend named Mitch, leaned over the counter. "Heard you caused quite a commotion at the train station today," Mitch remarked. Clayton shrugged. "News travels fast." "Always does when it involves standing on train tracks," Mitch replied dryly, "or crossing Jasper Holloway. What do you know about Thomas Patterson's debt to Holloway?" Clayton asked, keeping his voice low. Mitch glanced around before answering. "Not much concrete. Rumors say Patterson signed something when he was desperate for medicine for that lung sickness of his. Others say Holloway's forged documents before to get land he wanted. Patterson wasn't a fool. He wouldn't have signed away his daughter's inheritance. Maybe, maybe not. But Holloway has Judge Parker in his pocket and the new sheriff still finding his footing." Clayton finished his drink. "Who's handling Patterson's affairs? There must be a lawyer." "Old Man Graves was the Patterson family lawyer, but he died last winter. Don't know who took over." Clayton left a coin on the counter. "Thanks, Mitch. I'll be seeing you." "Watch yourself," Mitch warned. "Holloway doesn't like losing." Outside the saloon, Clayton paused in the shadows, scanning the street before heading toward his modest rented room above the livery stable. He was under no illusions about the danger of challenging Jasper Holloway, but something about the cattle baron's eagerness to remove Amelia from Laredo rang false. There was more to this story than a simple debt, and Clayton intended to discover what it was before Holloway made another attempt to eliminate the one person who stood between him and the Patterson ranch. Dawn broke over Laredo, painting the sky in watercolors of pink and gold that belied the tension simmering beneath the town's placid surface. Amelia rose early, borrowing a brush from Mrs. Ramirez to tame her unruly chestnut curls before pinning them into a simple chignon. Her black morning dress was wrinkled from yesterday's ordeal, but it was all she had. She found Mrs. Ramirez in the kitchen, kneading dough for morning bread. The older woman looked up with a smile that quickly turned to concern. "You did not sleep well," she observed. Amelia shook her head. "Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face. He built that ranch from nothing after the war. He wouldn't have risked losing it, especially knowing it would be my only security after he was gone. Men sometimes make mistakes when they are desperate," Mrs. Ramirez said gently. "But I agree it is not like Thomas Patterson to gamble with his daughter's future." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Amelia's heart quickened as Mrs. Ramirez went to answer it. A moment later, Clayton Wilson stood in the doorway of the kitchen, hat in hand, looking freshly shaven but weary, as though he too had passed a restless night. "Good morning, ladies," he greeted them, his eyes lingering on Amelia. "I trust you slept well, Miss Patterson." "Well enough, thank you," Amelia lied politely. "And yourself?" "I've had worse nights on cattle drives," he replied with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Ramirez, might I impose on your hospitality for a private conversation with Miss Patterson? I've been making inquiries about her situation." "Of course," Mrs. Ramirez replied. "Use the parlor. I will bring coffee." In the small, neat parlor, Amelia sat stiffly on a horsehair sofa while Clayton took the chair opposite. There was something reassuring about his presence, a steadiness that made her feel less adrift. "I spoke with several people last night," Clayton began once Mrs. Ramirez had delivered coffee and discreetly withdrawn. "There's talk that your father signed over the ranch to cover debts, but nobody seems clear on when or why these debts originated." "Because they don't exist," Amelia said firmly. "My father was cautious with money after Mother died. We lived simply, and any extra went back into the ranch. He kept meticulous records in his study, which is now in Holloway's possession," Clayton noted grimly. "Not everything," Amelia said, reaching into the pocket of her dress. She withdrew a small brass key. This opens my father's lockbox. He always kept it hidden under a loose floorboard in the kitchen. Said it contained things too important to risk. Clayton's eyes lit with interest. And where is this lockbox now? Hidden in the tool shed behind the house. Father's foreman, Mr. Jimenez, helped me conceal it before the funeral, when we suspected Holloway might make his move. Her voice caught. They drove Mr. Jimenez and his family off the property yesterday. I don't know where they've gone. The Jimenez family has relatives near the river, Clayton assured her. They'll be looked after. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Miss Patterson, Amelia, we need to retrieve that lockbox. But how? Holloway will have men watching the property. Fortunately, I know that land almost as well as you do, Clayton said. I worked every inch of it that summer I was in your father's employ. There's a stream that runs along the northern boundary with a stand of cottonwoods that provides cover almost to the house. I know it, Amelia confirmed. Father and I used to picnic there when I was a child. We'll go tonight, Clayton decided. After dark, when Holloway's men are likely to be less vigilant. Amelia set down her coffee cup with a determined clink. I'm coming with you. It's too dangerous. It's my home, she interrupted, her amber eyes flashing. My father's legacy, and I'm the only one who knows exactly where the lockbox is hidden. Clayton studied her for a long moment. The defiant tilt of her chin reminded him of Thomas Patterson's stubborn streak. Your father would be proud of your spirit, he finally said, but he'd also expect me to keep you safe. Then you'll have to do both, Amelia replied simply. Their planning was interrupted by another knock at the door. Mrs. Ramirez answered it, and they heard a brief, murmured exchange before she appeared in the parlor doorway, her expression troubled. Sheriff Dawson is here to see Miss Patterson, she announced. Sheriff Lyle Dawson was a tall, thin man with a drooping mustache that seemed to reflect his perpetually melancholy demeanor. He twisted his hat in his hands as he entered the parlor, nodding to Clayton before addressing Amelia. Miss Patterson, I'm sorry to disturb you during your time of mourning, he began awkwardly. What can I do for you, Sheriff? Amelia asked, her posture stiffening. There's been a complaint, Dawson continued, avoiding her gaze. Mr. Holloway alleges that you removed certain items from the Patterson property after it legally changed hands. Changed hands, Amelia repeated incredulously. My father was barely in his grave when Holloway's men forced me from my home at gunpoint. Sheriff Dawson shifted uncomfortably. I understand this is difficult, but Mr. Holloway has presented documentation showing your father transferred ownership to settle outstanding debts. Judge Parker has reviewed these documents and found them in order. Clayton stood, his presence suddenly commanding the small room. Has anyone bothered to authenticate Thomas Patterson's signature, or questioned why a dying man would sign away his only daughter's inheritance? That's not for me to decide, Dawson replied. I'm just doing my job. Which apparently includes harassing bereaved daughters instead of investigating armed coercion, Clayton observed coldly. The sheriff flushed. Now see here, Wilson. What items is Holloway claiming were removed? Amelia interrupted, placing a restraining hand on Clayton's arm. Dawson consulted a paper from his pocket. A strong box containing deeds, financial records, and personal papers belonging to the late Mr. Patterson. Amelia exchanged a quick glance with Clayton before composing her features. My father kept his important papers in his desk in the study. I haven't seen any strong box. It wasn't technically a lie she hadn't seen the lockbox since it was hidden. Sheriff Dawson studied her face, seeming to search for deception. Finding none, he sighed. Very well, Miss Patterson. But if such items do come to light, they should be turned over to Mr. Holloway as the legal property owner. "Is there anything else, Sheriff?" Clayton asked pointedly. "Just a friendly warning," Dawson said, his tone suggesting it was anything but friendly. "Holloway is convinced you have something that belongs to him. He won't stop looking. And in the meantime, it might be best if you remained within town limits, Miss Patterson, for your own safety." After the sheriff departed, Mrs. Ramirez joined them in the parlor, her face creased with worry. "This is worse than I feared. If Judge Parker has already ruled in Holloway's favor, it means Holloway has presented convincing forgeries," Clayton finished grimly. "And he's desperate to find that lockbox before we can use its contents against him." "We need to move faster than planned," Amelia said, her voice steady despite her pallor. "We can't wait until tonight." Clayton nodded slowly. "Agreed. Holloway will expect us to wait for darkness. Going now might catch them off guard." He turned to Mrs. Ramirez. "We'll need provisions and perhaps a change of clothes for Miss Patterson." The older woman nodded. "I will prepare something, and I will tell anyone who asks that you are resting in your room, overcome with grief." As Mrs. Ramirez bustled away, Amelia looked at Clayton, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I've never broken the law before." Clayton's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Technically, if those documents are forged, we're not breaking the law, we're recovering stolen property." "And if they're genuine?" Amelia asked softly. "Then your father had reasons we don't yet understand," Clayton replied, his voice gentle. "But we won't know until we find that lockbox." An hour later, they rode out of Laredo on Clayton's chestnut gelding, taking a circuitous route that led away from the Patterson ranch before doubling back along a seldom-used cattle trail. Amelia wore a simple brown riding skirt and jacket borrowed from Mrs. Ramirez's niece, with a wide-brimmed hat to shield her face from both sun and recognition. They rode in silence, each lost in their thoughts until the familiar silhouette of the Patterson ranch house appeared in the distance. Clayton guided his horse into a shallow ravine that provided cover as they approached. "There are two men on the porch," Clayton observed, passing his field glasses to Amelia. "And a wagon by the barn. Looks like they're inventorying the stock." Amelia's throat tightened as she viewed her home through the lenses. The whitewashed ranch house with its wide veranda had been her whole world for 23 years. Now strangers lounged on her father's rocking chairs, boots propped insolently on the railings. "We'll approach from the creek side," Clayton decided, taking back the glasses. "There's enough brush cover to get us to the tool shed undetected if we're careful." They left the horse secured in a cottonwood grove and proceeded on foot, crouching low as they made their way through the dense underbrush along the creek. The April sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat trickled down Amelia's back beneath the borrowed jacket. They paused at the edge of the cleared area behind the house. The tool shed stood about 50 yards away, a weather-beaten structure partially hidden by an ancient mesquite tree. "Stay here," Clayton whispered. "I'll check if the path is clear." "We go together," Amelia insisted. "I won't be left behind." Clayton looked like he wanted to argue but merely nodded. "Stay close. If I signal you to stop, freeze immediately." They moved in tandem, darting from the cover of a chicken coop to a stack of lumber, then to the shadow of the windmill. Each step brought them closer to the tool shed, and with each step, Amelia's heart pounded harder against her ribs. They were just yards from their destination when a voice called out from the direction of the barn. "Hey, who's out there?" Clayton pushed Amelia behind him as a ranch hand emerged, squinting in their direction. "Run for the shed," Clayton muttered. "I'll create a distraction." Before she could protest, Clayton stepped into the open, waving casually to the approaching man. "Afternoon. Mr. Holloway sent me to check the well pump. Says it's been giving trouble." The distraction worked long enough for Amelia to slip into the tool shed unnoticed. Inside, the air was hot and still, heavy with the smell of oil and leather. She moved quickly to the back wall, counting floor planks from the corner until she found the one with a small notch carved into its edge. Using a rusty pry bar, she carefully lifted the plank to reveal a cavity beneath. There, wrapped in oilcloth, was her father's lockbox, a rectangular metal container no bigger than a family Bible. Outside, she could hear Clayton's voice, still casual but moving closer to the shed as he spun a tale about Holloway's concerns over water supply. The ranch hand sounded skeptical but not yet alarmed. Amelia tucked the lockbox under her arm and replaced the floorboard. She was just straightening up when the shed door opened, momentarily silhouetting Clayton against the bright daylight. "Time to go," he said tersely. "Our friend is fetching the foreman." They slipped out the back of the shed and ran crouching toward the creek, the precious lockbox clutched against Amelia's chest. They had almost reached the safety of the cottonwoods when a shout went up from the direction of the house. "There they are." By the creek, the crack of a rifle shot split the air, and dirt kicked up just feet from where they ran. Clayton grabbed Amelia's arm, pulling her behind the trunk of a massive cottonwood just as another shot splintered bark where her head had been moments before. "Stay down," Clayton ordered, drawing his revolver. He fired 2 shots in the direction of their pursuers, not aiming to hit but to force them to take cover. The momentary respite allowed them to sprint to where Clayton's horse waited. He boosted Amelia into the saddle, handed her the reins, then swung up behind her. With a sharp whistle and a dig of his heels, the gelding lurched forward, nearly unseating them both as it plunged into the creek. More shots rang out behind them as they splashed across the shallow water and up the opposite bank. Clayton kept low over Amelia, shielding her with his body as they galloped away from the ranch, taking a route that would lead them deep into the brush country before circling back toward Laredo. Only when they were miles away, with no sign of pursuit, did Clayton finally slow the exhausted horse to a walk. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the dust of their flight. "No," Amelia replied, though her hands trembled where they gripped the reins. "You." "Just my pride," Clayton said with forced lightness. "Should have been more convincing to that hand." Amelia turned in the saddle to look at him, suddenly aware of his nearness, of the arm that still circled her waist protectively. His face was streaked with dust and sweat, his blue eyes intense as they met hers. "We got it," she said, nodding to the lockbox secured in her lap. "My father's secrets, whatever they may be." "Let's hope they're worth almost getting shot," Clayton replied, but there was no regret in his voice, only a fierce satisfaction that mirrored what Amelia felt. They had taken a stand against Jasper Holloway's tyranny. Whatever came next, they wouldn't face it empty-handed. As they rode slowly toward Laredo in the fading afternoon light, Amelia found herself leaning back slightly against Clayton's chest, drawing strength from his steady presence. The lockbox felt heavy in her lap, heavy with promise, heavy with her father's last legacy, and heavy with the weight of what they had just risked to retrieve it. She could only pray it contained the answers they needed. They didn't return directly to Mrs. Ramirez's boarding house. It would be the first place Holloway's men would look for them. Instead, Clayton guided his tired horse to a small adobe building on the outskirts of town. "My friend Miguel lives here," he explained as they dismounted. "He runs the livery where I keep my horse. We can trust him." The door opened before they could knock, revealing a stocky Mexican man with kind eyes and a wary expression. "Clayton," he greeted them, his gaze shifting to Amelia. "I heard there was trouble at the Patterson ranch, gunshots." "News travels fast," Clayton observed. "Miguel, this is Miss Amelia Patterson. We need a safe place to rest and examine some documents." Miguel ushered them inside without hesitation. The interior was simple but clean, with colorful woven blankets brightening the adobe walls. "My wife is visiting her sister," he explained. "You will have privacy." He brought them water, beans, and tortillas, then discreetly withdrew to tend the livery, promising to keep watch and warn them of any suspicious activity. Alone at last, Amelia placed the lockbox on Miguel's rough-hewn table. Her fingers trembled slightly as she inserted the small brass key. The lock turned with a satisfying click, and she raised the lid. Inside were several folded documents, a small leather-bound journal, and a velvet pouch. Amelia removed the documents first, carefully unfolding yellowed papers that crackled beneath her fingers. "These are the original deeds to the ranch," she said, scanning the first document. "Dated 1852, when my grandfather first settled here." Clayton leaned over her shoulder, his nearness sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. "Any recent transfers or liens?" Amelia shook her head as she examined each paper. "Nothing. According to these, the Patterson ranch still belongs to—" She paused, rereading a passage. "To me. Father transferred ownership to me on my 21st birthday 2 years ago." "Let me see," Clayton said, taking the document she indicated. He studied it carefully. "This is properly notarized and filed with the county. You've been the legal owner for 2 years. But that means any debt agreement Holloway claims to have," Amelia began, "would require your signature, not just your father's," Clayton finished, his expression hardening. "Holloway's documents must be forgeries." Amelia reached for the journal next. Inside were her father's neat, precise entries detailing ranch operations, cattle sales, and expenses. The final pages contained something unexpected, a series of cryptic entries documenting meetings with a J.H. and references to the Creek property. J.H. must be Jasper Holloway, Amelia mused. "But what's this about Creek property?" Clayton flipped back through the journal, stopping at an entry from the previous summer. "Here your father mentions discovering something on the north section, near the creek. Says it could change everything." Amelia frowned. "That's where we were today." "I don't recall anything unusual there." "What's in the pouch?" Clayton asked. Amelia loosened the velvet pouch's drawstring and tipped the contents into her palm. A small rock tumbled out, unremarkable except for a distinctive metallic yellow gleam running through its gray surface. Clayton whistled softly. "That's gold ore." Amelia stared at the rock in disbelief. "Gold on our ranch? That's impossible." "Not impossible," Clayton said thoughtfully, "just unlikely. But if your father found a deposit, it would explain why Holloway suddenly became so interested in our worthless scrubland," Amelia finished. "He must have found out somehow." They continued through the documents, discovering a detailed map marking a specific location along the creek, along with assay reports confirming the presence of gold, not a mother lode, but enough to make the land exponentially more valuable than its worth as cattle range. "Your father was smart," Clayton observed. "He kept this quiet, transferred the ranch to you for protection, and documented everything legally." He looked up at Amelia, his eyes intense. "With these papers, we can prove Holloway's claim is fraudulent. But will it be enough?" Amelia asked. "You said yourself that Judge Parker is in Holloway's pocket." "Judge Parker may be compromised, but the federal marshal isn't," Clayton replied. "These documents show attempted land theft through forgery. That's a federal matter." Hope bloomed in Amelia's chest for the first time since her father's death. "How soon can we reach the marshal? He visits Laredo every other week. Should be due tomorrow or the next day." Clayton glanced toward the window where dusk was falling. "But first, we need to survive the night." Holloway will be looking for us and for this lockbox with every man he can muster." As if summoned by his words, Miguel appeared at the door, his expression grave. "Clayton, there are men in town asking questions, showing your description and the señoritas. They are offering money for information." Clayton nodded grimly. "We can't stay here, it puts you at risk." "Where will we go?" Amelia asked, gathering the documents back into the lockbox. "I have a place," Clayton said after a moment's thought. "It's not comfortable, but it's safe. An old line shack about 10 miles west of here from when I worked the Diamondback spread." Miguel disappeared briefly, returning with a burlap sack. "Food," he explained, handing it to Clayton, "and blankets. The nights are still cold." "I'll return your horse as soon as I can," Clayton promised. "Keep him as long as needed," Miguel replied. "He is strong and he knows your hand." He turned to Amelia with a slight bow. "Señorita Patterson, my prayers go with you. Your father was respected by many in Laredo, even if some lacked the courage to stand against Holloway." They slipped out the back way as full darkness fell, leading the horse through alleyways until they reached the edge of town. Only then did Clayton help Amelia mount before swinging up behind her. As they rode west under a canopy of stars, Amelia clutched the precious lockbox to her chest. She was exhausted, saddle-sore, and still grieving her father's death, yet she felt strangely alive. For the first time in months, she was taking action rather than merely reacting to circumstances beyond her control. And despite the danger surrounding them, she couldn't ignore the warmth of Clayton's solid presence behind her, or the way her heart quickened when his breath stirred the hair at her temple as he leaned forward to murmur directions. The line shack appeared as a darker shadow against the night sky, a small, squat structure nestled against a rocky outcropping. It was basic shelter: 4 walls, a roof, a stone fireplace, and little else. Clayton lit a lantern he found inside, revealing a dusty interior with a narrow cot, a rough table, and a chair missing one leg. "It's not much," he said apologetically, "but Holloway's men won't think to look here." "It's perfect," Amelia replied sincerely. After all they'd been through, any safe haven seemed luxurious. Clayton busied himself starting a small fire in the fireplace while Amelia arranged Miguel's blankets on the cot. The domestic scene felt strangely intimate, as though they were playing at being husband and wife rather than fugitives hiding from a powerful enemy. They ate a simple meal of beans, jerky, and hardtack from Miguel's provisions, sitting side by side on a blanket spread before the fire. The food was plain but satisfying, and the warmth of the flames gradually chased the chill from the small room. "You should take the cot," Clayton said when they had finished eating. "I'll keep watch." "You need rest too," Amelia protested. "We can share the watch." "I know how to use a gun my father taught me." Clayton raised an eyebrow. "Did he now?" "He said a woman alone on the frontier needs to protect herself," Amelia explained. "I'm a fair shot with his Winchester." A smile tugged at Clayton's mouth. "Thomas Patterson raised a daughter in his own image, it seems." "You knew him well?" Amelia asked, realizing how little she knew about the man who had risked his life for her. "Well enough to respect him," Clayton replied, poking at the fire. "I was just a drifter when I arrived in Laredo. 17 years old with nothing but my saddle and a decent hand with horses. Your father hired me when bigger outfits wouldn't take a chance on an unknown kid." "I remember," Amelia said softly. "You were quiet, always volunteering for the hardest jobs." Clayton glanced at her, surprised. "You remember me from back then." A blush warmed Amelia's cheeks. "I was 16. I noticed the new ranch hands, especially the handsome ones with kind eyes," she didn't add. "I left after that season," Clayton continued. "Needed to earn more if I was ever going to have my own spread." drove cattle up to Kansas, worked ranches across 3 states, but I always planned to come back to Texas." He paused, his expression thoughtful. "Your father wrote to me once about 3 years ago, said if I ever returned to Laredo, there'd be a job for me." "He must have thought highly of you," Amelia observed. "I like to think so," Clayton replied. "Which is why I couldn't stand by yesterday and watch his daughter be forced from her home." Their eyes met across the flickering firelight, and something passed between them, an understanding, a connection, perhaps even the first tendrils of something deeper. Amelia was the first to look away, suddenly conscious of their isolation and the impropriety of their situation. "You should rest," Clayton said gently. "Tomorrow we'll need to plan our next move carefully." Amelia nodded, rising to her feet. At the cot she hesitated, then unfolded one of the blankets and brought it back to Clayton. "At least be comfortable while you keep watch." Their fingers brushed as she handed him the blanket, and the contact sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the static electricity of the wool. "Thank you," Clayton said, his voice rougher than before. Amelia retreated to the cot, removing only her boots before lying down fully clothed. The thin mattress crackled with straw beneath her weight, but after the day's exertions, it felt like the softest feather bed. She expected sleep to claim her immediately, but instead found herself acutely aware of Clayton's presence across the room, the sound of his breathing, the occasional clink as he checked his revolver, the soft rasp of his boot against the packed earth floor when he rose to add wood to the fire. "Clayton," she said softly into the dimness. "Yes. Why did you really come back to Laredo?" There was a long pause before he answered. "I saved enough for a small place, not grand but mine. I wanted to put down roots somewhere that felt like home." Laredo was the closest I ever came to that feeling. The simple honesty of his answer touched something deep within Amelia. She understood that yearning for home, for permanence in a world that constantly threatened to sweep away everything familiar. "I'm glad you came back," she whispered, unsure if he could hear her. But he did. "So am I," came his quiet reply, with those words warming her heart. Amelia finally drifted into sleep, the lockbox secure beside her, its contents offering hope that her own sense of home might yet be restored. Dawn arrived with tentative fingers of light probing through the lined shack's single grimy window. Amelia awoke to find Clayton standing at the door, peering out at the awakening landscape. He looked tired but alert, his profile etched against the early light. "Any trouble?" she asked, sitting up and smoothing her rumpled clothing. Clayton shook his head. "All quiet. I rode out a ways before first light to check our back trail. No sign of pursuit." "You should have woken me for my watch," Amelia chided gently. A smile touched his lips. "You needed the rest more than I needed sleep." They shared a simple breakfast from Miguel's provisions, the last of the jerky, some dried apples, and water from Clayton's canteen. As they ate, Clayton outlined his plan. The federal marshal should arrive in Laredo today or tomorrow. "Our safest approach is to wait here until evening, then circle around to the south side of town after dark. There's a lawyer there, Abraham Lincoln Jones, who's no friend of Holloway's. He'll shelter us until the marshal arrives." "Is he trustworthy?" Amelia asked. "He stood up to Holloway last year when the cattle baron tried to force the Martinez family off their farm," Clayton replied. "Cost him some business, but earned him respect." Amelia nodded, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the lockbox. "I've been thinking about my father's journal. The entries about meetings with Holloway started months ago, well before Father's health declined severely." "You think Holloway approached him about buying the land?" Clayton surmised. "Possibly. Father might have refused initially, not knowing about the gold, but as his illness worsened." She paused, swallowing hard. He might have considered selling part of the property for my security. But he never went through with it, Clayton reminded her. Instead, he transferred ownership to you and documented the gold find. He was protecting your interests until the end. Amelia blinked back sudden tears. I just wish he'd told me. We could have faced Holloway together while he was still alive. Clayton reached across the rough table, his hand covering hers briefly. Your father did the best he could with the time he had. Now it's our job to make sure his efforts weren't in vain. The gentle pressure of his hand and the quiet conviction in his voice steadied Amelia. She nodded, drawing a deep breath. What do we do until nightfall? Rest. Prepare. Clayton rose from the table, and I should tend to the horse. He earned his oats yesterday. While Clayton cared for the gelding, Amelia sorted through the documents once more, organizing them for presentation to the marshal. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't immediately notice Clayton's return or his sudden stillness in the doorway. Riders coming, he said quietly, his hand moving to his holstered revolver. 3 of them from the east. Amelia's heart lurched. Holloway's men, can't tell yet. Clayton moved to the window, keeping to the side to avoid being silhouetted. They're not trying to hide their approach, which could mean they're not looking for us specifically. Or it could be a trap, Amelia pointed out, hastily returning the documents to the lockbox. Clayton nodded grimly. Either way, we can't stay here. There's a ravine about a quarter-mile west. If we can reach it unseen, it leads into rough country where we'd be hard to track. They moved quickly, Clayton extinguishing the last embers in the fireplace while Amelia gathered their few belongings. The lockbox went into Miguel's burlap sack, which Clayton slung over his shoulder before checking his revolver one last time. Stay low and follow my lead, he instructed as they slipped out the back of the lined shack, where the horse was tethered in a small natural alcove formed by the rocky outcropping. They led the animal on foot, keeping the shack between themselves and the approaching riders as they made for the ravine. The ground was hard and rocky, which helped minimize their tracks, but also made for treacherous footing. They had covered perhaps half the distance to safety when a shout went up behind them. They'd been spotted. Run, Clayton urged, helping Amelia mount before swinging up behind her. He dug his heels into the gelding's flanks, and the horse leaped forward, powerful muscles bunching as it galloped toward the ravine. Gunshots cracked behind them, but at this distance, the riders had little chance of hitting a moving target. Still, Amelia flinched as a bullet whined past her ear, too close for comfort. They reached the ravine and plunged down its steep side, the horse sliding on its haunches as loose rock and dirt cascaded around them. At the bottom, Clayton guided the animal into the shelter of the ravine's twisting path, where the high walls provided cover from both bullets and visibility. They'll have to follow single file, Clayton said over the pounding of hooves. That gives us an advantage. The ravine narrowed as they pressed forward, eventually opening into a maze of similar channels carved by ancient flash floods. Clayton navigated confidently, taking turns seemingly at random, but with the assurance of someone who knew this wilderness intimately. Behind them, they could hear the occasional shout and the clatter of pursuing horses, but the sounds grew fainter as Clayton's knowledge of the terrain allowed them to increase their lead. By midday, they had left the ravine system behind and entered a region of low, rolling hills dotted with mesquite and cacti. Clayton finally allowed the horse to slow to a walk, both to rest the animal and to minimize the dust that might betray their position. We've lost them for now, he said, scanning the horizon behind them. But they'll keep searching. Holloway doesn't give up easily. Where are we? Amelia asked, looking around at the unfamiliar landscape. About 15 miles southwest of Laredo, Clayton replied. We'll circle around and approach from the south after dark, as planned. It'll mean a few more hours in the saddle. Are you up for it?" Amelia straightened her spine, ignoring the ache in her muscles from the punishing ride. "Of course." Clayton's arm tightened briefly around her waist, an unconscious gesture of support that sent warmth spreading through Amelia, despite their precarious situation. They rested briefly in the shadow of a limestone outcropping, sharing the last of their water and giving the horse time to recover. The April sun beat down mercilessly, and Amelia was grateful for the borrowed hat that shielded her face from the worst of its glare. "When this is over," she said quietly, breaking the companionable silence that had fallen between them, "what will you do?" Clayton looked surprised by the question. "Assuming we're successful in exposing Holloway's fraud, I suppose I'll get back to my original plan, buying that small spread I mentioned." "Where is it?" Amelia asked, curious about this dream he'd worked toward for years. "About 10 miles north of Laredo," Clayton replied. "Nothing fancy, 100 acres with decent water and enough grazing for a modest herd. Previous owner let it go to seed, but the bones are good." "It sounds wonderful," Amelia said sincerely. Clayton's eyes met hers, something unreadable flickering in their blue depths. "And you? Will you stay in Laredo, run the Patterson ranch yourself?" The question gave Amelia pause. She'd been so focused on reclaiming her inheritance that she hadn't thought much beyond that goal. "I suppose I will," she said slowly. "It's all I know. And now, with the gold discovery, I'll have resources to improve the operation." She hesitated. "Though I'd need a good foreman, someone who knows ranching." "I might know someone suitable," Clayton said with the hint of a smile. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Amelia found herself imagining a future where Clayton Wilson was more than just her foreman, where shared work led to shared lives, where his quiet strength complemented her determination. The fantasy was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Clayton was on his feet instantly, helping Amelia up and guiding her to where the horse waited. "Time to move," he said tersely. "They're circling back this way." They rode hard through the afternoon, using every fold in the land for cover, doubling back occasionally to confuse their trail. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Laredo was visible in the distance, its buildings shimmering in the heat haze. They approached cautiously, keeping to the brush and arroyos that dotted the landscape south of town. Night had fallen by the time they reached the outskirts, which worked to their advantage as they made their way through the shadows to a modest clapboard house set back from the main streets. A single lantern burned in the front window, its warm glow a beacon in the darkness. Clayton dismounted first, then helped Amelia down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Let me do the talking," he murmured as they approached the door. "Jones is cautious by nature." The man who answered Clayton's soft knock was tall and gaunt, with a shock of white hair and spectacles that magnified his shrewd eyes. He peered at them suspiciously before recognition dawned. "Wilson," he said in a hushed voice. "And good heavens, is that Thomas Patterson's girl?" "It is indeed, Mr. Jones," Amelia confirmed. "We're in need of your help." Abraham Lincoln Jones, named by an overly patriotic father during the Civil War, ushered them inside quickly, glancing up and down the street before closing and bolting his door. "I've heard rumors," he said without preamble. "Holloway's men are searching the county for you too, something about stolen documents and trespassing." "The only theft and trespassing has been Holloway's," Clayton replied grimly. "We have proof that his claim to the Patterson ranch is fraudulent." Jones's bushy eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "That would explain the bounty." "Bounty?" Amelia echoed, alarmed. $500 for information leading to your capture, Jones confirmed. Officially for theft of property, but the word in town is that Holloway wants you silenced before you can speak to the federal marshal. Has Marshal Blackwood arrived yet? Clayton asked. Jones shook his head. Expected tomorrow. There was trouble up near Austin that delayed him. He gestured toward his small dining room. Come, sit. You both look exhausted. I'll have my housekeeper prepare something hot. Over a simple but hearty meal of corn bread and beef stew, they showed Jones the contents of the lockbox. The lawyer examined each document with meticulous care, occasionally murmuring to himself or making notes on a pad beside his plate. "This is quite extraordinary," he said finally, looking up at Amelia. "Not only is the property legally yours, but these assay reports confirm a significant gold deposit. Small wonder Holloway resorted to forgery. Can you help us present this evidence to Marshal Blackwood?" Amelia asked. "Most certainly," Jones replied, removing his spectacles to polish them thoughtfully. "Though I must warn you Holloway won't simply surrender. Even with these documents, he'll fight. He has influence in this county, and gold can corrupt even the most upstanding citizens." "We're aware of the risks," Clayton said, his hand unconsciously moving to cover Amelia's on the table. "But Miss Patterson has a right to her property and to justice for what Holloway has attempted." Jones noted the protective gesture with a slight smile. "Indeed she does. And it seems she has a most dedicated advocate in you, Mr. Wilson." Amelia felt heat rise in her cheeks, but didn't withdraw her hand from beneath Clayton's. His touch anchored her, reminding her that she wasn't facing this battle alone. "You'll both stay here tonight," Jones decided. "My housekeeper can prepare the guest room for Miss Patterson. Mr. Wilson can use the study, there's a passable cot there." The arrangements were made, and after securing Clayton's horse in Jones's small stable, they settled in for the night. Amelia found herself in a plain but comfortable bedroom, the first proper bed she'd seen since fleeing Mrs. Ramirez's boarding house. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. She lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar creaks of Jones's house and the distant sounds of Laredo's nightlife. Her mind raced with questions and possibilities. What if the marshal didn't believe them? What if Holloway's influence extended to federal law enforcement? What if a soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts? She rose, wrapping a borrowed shawl around her shoulders before opening the door to find Clayton standing in the hallway, his expression troubled. "I apologize for disturbing you," he said quietly. "I saw a light under your door and thought you might be awake." "I can't seem to quiet my mind," Amelia admitted. "May I come in?" Just for a moment, propriety demanded she refuse, but Amelia found herself stepping aside to admit him. With the door left pointedly ajar for the sake of appearances, they sat together on the edge of the bed, their voices hushed to avoid waking Jones. "I've been thinking," Clayton began, "about what happens after tomorrow, if all goes well with the marshal." "As have I," Amelia replied. "Holloway won't be easily defeated, even with the law on our side," Clayton continued. "He's the type to seek revenge. You'll need protection while the legal matters are settled." Amelia smiled faintly. "Are you offering your services as bodyguard, Mr. Wilson?" "Among other things," he replied, his gaze direct and unwavering. "Amelia, I know this may seem sudden, especially given all that's happened, but I've been thinking about you since the moment I saw you at that train station." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. "Clayton, let me finish," he said gently. "I admired your father greatly. He was a good man who gave me a chance when others wouldn't. But what I feel for you has nothing to do with obligation or debt. These past 2 days, riding together, Facing danger together, I've come to care for you in a way I didn't expect." The sincerity in his voice made Amelia's heart flutter. "I've felt it too," she confessed. "There's something between us that seems to have been there from the start." Clayton took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "When this is over, when your ranch is secured and Holloway is no longer a threat, I'd like to court you properly, if you're amenable." A warm glow spread through Amelia's chest. "I'm more than amenable," she said softly. "I'm eager for it." Their eyes held for a long moment, full of promise and unspoken feelings. Then, mindful of their precarious situation and the open door, Clayton raised her hand to his lips for a brief, chaste kiss. "We should rest," he said, reluctantly releasing her hand and rising to his feet. "Tomorrow may prove challenging." "Good night, Clayton," Amelia said, her fingers still tingling where his lips had touched. "Good night, Amelia," he replied, pausing at the door. "Sleep well, knowing that whatever comes, we face it together." As he disappeared down the hallway toward the study, Amelia felt a curious sense of peace settle over her. The problems awaiting them hadn't changed, but somehow, knowing that Clayton Wilson would be by her side made them seem less daunting. She slept deeply after that, dreamless and restful, until Jones's housekeeper knocked on her door with first light. Morning brought a flurry of activity as Jones prepared to present their case to Marshal Blackwood. The lawyer insisted on copying key documents, insurance, he called it, and drafted a formal complaint against Jasper Holloway for forgery, fraud, and attempted theft of property. The marshal should arrive on the noon stage, Jones informed them over breakfast. "Until then, I suggest you both remain indoors. Holloway has men watching the streets." They passed the tense hours of waiting by reviewing their strategy, with Jones drilling them on what to expect during their meeting with the marshal. Amelia was grateful for the distraction, though she couldn't help noticing how Clayton's gaze found hers whenever Jones's attention was elsewhere, communicating silent encouragement. Shortly after noon, Jones's housekeeper hurried into the dining room where they were gathered. "The stage has arrived, sir," she reported, "and Mr. Holloway is at the station with Sheriff Dawson." Jones frowned. "As expected, Holloway will try to reach Blackwood first to poison the well against us." He rose from his chair. "I'll go meet the marshal myself, explain that we have urgent business requiring his immediate attention." "It's too risky," Clayton objected. "Holloway's men will be watching for any of us." "They know your faces and Miss Patterson's," Jones replied. "But I'm just an old lawyer going about his business. Besides, Blackwood and I have history, he'll listen to me." Before they could argue further, Jones donned his hat and coat and slipped out the back door, leaving them with instructions to remain hidden until his return. The next hour was excruciating. Amelia paced the small parlor, alternating between anxiety and determination. Clayton remained outwardly calm, but she noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand occasionally drifted to his holstered revolver at unexpected sounds. Finally, they heard voices at the front door, Jones's familiar tenor and another, deeper voice with the clipped precision of an educated Easterner. The door opened to admit Jones, and a tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard and the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. "Miss Patterson, Mr. Wilson," Jones said formally, "may I present Federal Marshal Daniel Blackwood?" "Marshal, these are the witnesses I mentioned." Blackwood removed his hat, revealing steel-gray hair and keen eyes that missed nothing as they swept over Amelia and Clayton. "Mr. Jones has informed me of some serious allegations against Jasper Holloway," he said without preamble. "I understand you have evidence to support these claims." "We do, Marshal," Amelia replied, stepping forward with the lockbox. Everything you need to see is right here." For the next hour, they presented their case, the original deeds showing Amelia's ownership, the assay reports confirming gold on the property, her father's journal documenting Holloway's interest, and the circumstances of her forced eviction and near expulsion from Laredo. Blackwood listened impassively, examining each document with careful attention and asking occasional sharp questions. When they finished, he sat back in his chair, fingers steepled before him. "This is a troubling matter," he said finally. "If your allegations are true, and the evidence certainly suggests they are, then Mr. Holloway has committed several federal offenses." "Then you believe us?" Amelia asked, hardly daring to hope. "The documents appear genuine," Blackwood acknowledged. "And Mr. Jones's reputation lends credibility to your account. However," he added, raising a cautionary hand, "Holloway has already filed charges against you both for theft and trespassing. He claims you stole valuable papers from property he legally purchased." "That's absurd," Clayton interjected. "How can it be trespassing or theft when the property legally belongs to Miss Patterson?" "Precisely the question that must be resolved," Blackwood agreed. "Which is why I need to speak with Holloway directly, confronting him with this evidence." He turned to Amelia. "Miss Patterson, I must ask you to surrender these documents to me temporarily. They will be returned once this matter is settled." Amelia hesitated, reluctant to part with their only leverage. "And what about us, Marshal?" "Holloway's men are hunting us with orders to bring us in or worse." "You'll remain here under my protection," Blackwood assured her. "I'll station one of my deputies outside while I deal with Holloway." Jones cleared his throat. "If I may, Marshal, having known Holloway for years, I suggest approaching him with caution. He won't surrender easily, especially with so much at stake." "I'm well aware of Mr. Holloway's reputation," Blackwood replied dryly, "which is why I brought 3 deputies with me to Laredo. This won't be the first time I've dealt with a man who believes himself above the law." After Blackwood departed with the documents, taking one of Jones's copies for safekeeping, the waiting began anew. The marshal had promised to return by evening with news, but as afternoon stretched into dusk with no word, anxiety gnawed at Amelia's composure. "What's taking so long?" she fretted, peering through the curtains at the darkening street. Clayton gently drew her away from the window. "Legal matters move slowly," he reminded her, "and Holloway will be putting up every obstacle he can think of." "I should have gone with the marshal," Amelia said, twisting her hands. "It's my property, my fight." "Blackwood knows what he's doing," Jones assured her from his desk, where he was reviewing his copies of the documents. "He's built cases against men far more dangerous than Jasper Holloway." A sharp knock at the front door startled them all. Jones motioned for them to stay back while he answered it, one hand discreetly moving to the derringer he kept in his vest pocket. It was Blackwood's deputy, his expression grim. "Marshal says you should all come to the courthouse right away," he reported. "Holloway's demanding a hearing before Judge Parker tonight." "Tonight?" Jones exclaimed. "That's highly irregular." "Holloway insisted and the judge agreed," the deputy replied with a shrug. "Marshal thinks it might be better this way, get everything out in the open at once." They hurried through the now dark streets, the deputy leading the way while keeping a watchful eye for any threat. The Laredo courthouse was ablaze with light, unusual for this hour. A small crowd had gathered outside, drawn by rumors of a confrontation between Holloway and the federal marshal. Inside, the courtroom was tense with anticipation. Holloway sat at one table with his lawyer, a slick-looking man from San Antonio known for representing wealthy clients regardless of their guilt. Marshal Blackwood stood near the judge's bench, the lockbox and its contents arrayed before him. When Amelia entered with Clayton and Jones, Holloway's head snapped around, his face contorting with barely suppressed fury. Judge Parker, a portly man with mutton-chop sideburns and a perpetual scowl, looked equally displeased at her arrival. "Ah, Miss Patterson," the judge said coldly. "How convenient that you've decided to grace us with your presence after evading the law for days." "Your Honor," Blackwood interjected before Amelia could respond, "Miss Patterson has been under my protection as a material witness in a federal investigation. She hasn't been evading anything." Judge Parker's scowl deepened. "This is a simple property dispute, Marshal, hardly a federal matter." "With respect, Your Honor, it's considerably more than that," Blackwood countered, gesturing to the documents spread before him. "We have evidence of forgery, fraud, and attempted theft of valuable mineral rights, all federal offenses." "Preposterous!" Holloway burst out, rising to his feet. "I purchased the Patterson property legally. I have the signed agreement right here." He slapped a document onto the table. "May I approach, Your Honor?" Jones asked. When the judge grudgingly nodded, the lawyer stepped forward to examine Holloway's document. "This purports to be signed by Thomas Patterson, but not by his daughter, the legal owner of the property for the past 2 years. Thomas Patterson was the owner." Holloway insisted. "The girl's name was added to the deed without proper filing." "That's a lie," Amelia said clearly, her voice carrying through the courtroom. "I have the transfer deed right there, properly notarized and filed with the county 2 years ago." She pointed to one of the documents before the marshal. Judge Parker reluctantly examined the conflicting papers, his expression souring as he compared signatures and dates. "These appear to be in order," he admitted reluctantly, indicating the Patterson documents. "But Mr. Holloway's agreement is also signed by Thomas Patterson." "A forgery, Your Honor," Blackwood stated flatly. "I've already had an expert examine both signatures. The one on Holloway's document doesn't match authenticated examples of Patterson's handwriting." The courtroom erupted in murmurs at this revelation. Judge Parker banged his gavel for order, his face flushing with either embarrassment or anger, possibly both. "There's more, Your Honor," Blackwood continued when quiet was restored. "The Patterson property contains a gold deposit discovered by Thomas Patterson shortly before his death. The assay reports confirm it. I believe this is the real reason for Mr. Holloway's sudden interest in land he previously described as worthless scrub." At the word gold, the murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Holloway's lawyer leaned over to whisper urgently in his client's ear, but Holloway shoved him away, his face mottled with rage. "This is a conspiracy," he shouted, pointing at Amelia and Clayton. "They fabricated those documents after stealing my property records." "Your property records?" Clayton repeated incredulously. "You just said you purchased the land legally. If so, why would the original deeds and assay reports be in your possession rather than in the county record office?" Holloway realized his mistake too late. His mouth worked silently for a moment before he lunged toward the documents on the bench, as if to destroy the evidence. Marshal Blackwood intercepted him easily, restraining him with a firm grip. "Jasper Holloway," Blackwood announced formally, "I'm placing you under arrest for forgery, fraud, and attempted theft of property." "You have the right to remain silent. You can't do this," Holloway sputtered. "Parker, tell him. He has no authority here." Judge Parker cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Actually, Mr. Holloway, in matters of suspected federal crimes, Marshal Blackwood has full authority." He straightened his robes, visibly distancing himself from his former ally. "Given the evidence presented, I have no choice but to invalidate any claim you may have made to the Patterson property and return full ownership to Miss Amelia Patterson, effective immediately." The judge's sudden reversal was transparent to everyone present. Parker was abandoning Holloway to save his own reputation. But Amelia didn't care about the judge's motivations. All that mattered was that her home was hers again. As Blackwood's deputies led a still protesting Holloway away, Amelia found herself surrounded by townspeople offering congratulations and apologies for not standing with her sooner. Through the press of bodies, her eyes found Clayton's. He stood a little apart, watching her with quiet pride and something that made her heart skip and her cheeks warm despite the lingering tension of the confrontation. Later, as they walked back to Jones's house under the stars, Clayton offered Amelia his arm. She took it gladly, leaning into his solid strength. "It's over," she said, still scarcely believing it. "We won." "You won," Clayton corrected gently. "It was your courage and determination that saw this through." "I couldn't have done it without you," Amelia insisted. "You stood on train tracks for me, Clayton Wilson. I won't soon forget that." They paused beneath a cottonwood tree, its new leaves rustling softly in the night breeze. Away from prying eyes, Clayton turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Amelia," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I meant what I said last night. When things settle, I want to court you properly." "Things have settled," she replied, squeezing his hands. "Holloway is in custody, my ranch is restored, and I find myself in need of a foreman who knows the land and isn't afraid to stand up to cattle barons or charging locomotives." Clayton chuckled. "Is that a job offer, Miss Patterson?" "It's more than that," Amelia said softly, gathering her courage. "It's a beginning." In the silver moonlight, with the sounds of Laredo muted by distance, Clayton Wilson lowered his head and kissed Amelia Patterson for the first time. It was gentle and brief, mindful of propriety even in their relative privacy. But it sealed a promise between them, a promise of partnership, of shared dreams, and of a love born in adversity but destined to flourish in peace. 3 months later, the Patterson Ranch was thriving under joint management. The gold deposit, while not extensive enough to make them vastly wealthy, provided capital for much-needed improvements. The main house gleamed with fresh paint. The herds were increasing, and Mr. Jimenez had returned as ranch foreman, bringing his family to live in a newly built cottage near the main house. On a warm July evening, Amelia sat on the veranda, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and gold. The sound of hoofbeats announced Clayton's return from checking the north pasture, and she smiled as he approached, still struck by how right it felt to see him riding up to her home, their home, as it was increasingly becoming. "How are the new calves?" she asked as he joined her on the veranda, hat in hand. "Growing fast," Clayton replied, settling into the chair beside hers. "Another month and they'll be ready for branding." They sat in comfortable silence for a time, enjoying the cooling evening air and each other's company. Over the past months, their courtship had progressed with a natural ease that surprised them both. Clayton had taken rooms in town at first, visiting the ranch daily, but as weeks passed and their feelings deepened, he had gradually moved his belongings to the ranch house, occupying the guest room. Of course, propriety still being observed despite the isolated location. "I had a letter from Marshal Blackwood today," Amelia mentioned, breaking the companionable silence. "Holloway's trial is scheduled for next month in Austin. They want me to testify." Clayton nodded thoughtfully. "I expected as much. I'll accompany you, of course." "I knew you would," Amelia said with a warm smile. "It will be good to see this through to the end." "Speaking of seeing things through," Clayton said, a sudden nervousness entering his manner, "there's something I've been meaning to discuss with you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Amelia's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a simple gold band set with a modest diamond that caught the last rays of the setting sun. "Amelia Patterson," Clayton said, moving to kneel before her chair. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. I came back to Laredo looking to put down roots to find a place that felt like home. Instead, I found that home isn't a place at all, it's a person. It's you." Tears blurred Amelia's vision as he continued, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "I know it hasn't been long, but I've never been more certain of anything. I love you, Amelia. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Amelia whispered, her voice strengthening as joy flooded through her. "Yes, Clayton Wilson, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her, a longer, deeper kiss than propriety might strictly allow. Though there were no witnesses save the lengthening shadows and the first emerging stars, Amelia marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From that terrible day at the train station, when all seemed lost, to this perfect evening on her veranda, planning a shared future with the man who had quite literally stopped a train for her, it seemed almost too much happiness to contain. Later, as they walked arm in arm toward the pasture where twilight was settling over the contented herd, Clayton asked, "When would you like the wedding to be?" "Autumn, I think," Amelia replied. "When the worst heat has passed. A small ceremony here at the ranch with our friends." She glanced up at him. "Unless you had something grander in mind," Clayton shook his head, smiling. "Nothing grander than making you my wife, wherever and however that happens." "Always the smooth talker," Amelia teased, though she was secretly pleased by his words. "Only with you," he replied. "And only because I mean every word." They sealed this promise with another kiss as the first stars appeared above them, witnesses to a love forged in crisis, but built to last through whatever challenges life might bring. The autumn wedding was everything Amelia had envisioned: simple, joyful, and held on Patterson land with those who had stood by them during their ordeal. Mrs. Ramirez wept openly. Miguel beamed with pride as he served as Clayton's best man, and even Marshal Blackwood rode down from Austin to attend, bringing news that Jasper Holloway had been convicted and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Judge Parker, attempting to rehabilitate his reputation, performed the ceremony with unusual warmth, pronouncing them man and wife as golden leaves drifted down from the cottonwoods, and a gentle breeze carried their vows across the land that had brought them together. That night, as husband and wife retired to the main bedroom, no longer concerned with maintaining separate quarters or appearances, Amelia Wilson felt a contentment so complete it seemed almost unreal. "What are you thinking?" Clayton asked as he joined her by the window where she stood gazing at the star-filled Texas sky. "I'm thinking about that day at the train station," she replied, leaning back against his chest as his arms encircled her waist. "How close I came to losing everything: my home, my future." She turned in his embrace, raising a hand to his cheek. "Instead, I found everything I never knew I wanted." "I found the same," Clayton murmured, turning his head to kiss her palm. "A brave, beautiful woman who makes me want to be worthy of her every day." "You already are," Amelia assured him, rising on tiptoe to bring her lips to his. "You always have been." 5 years later, the Wilson-Patterson Ranch, as it was now known throughout Laredo County, had become one of the most prosperous operations in South Texas. The modest gold deposit had been carefully managed, providing capital for expansion without attracting the kind of attention that often led to trouble in mining regions. Clayton and Amelia had built a life together that exceeded both their dreams, working side by side to improve the land, increase their herds, and create a legacy for their growing family. 3-year-old Thomas, named for his grandfather, and 1-year-old Elizabeth, who had her mother's chestnut curls and her father's clear blue eyes. On a crisp October morning, much like the day they had exchanged their vows, Amelia stood on the veranda watching Clayton teach little Thomas to ride his first pony, a gentle, patient animal that plodded dutifully around the corral while the boy shrieked with delight. Elizabeth dozed in her mother's arms, occasionally blinking awake to observe the proceedings before returning to her nap. "He has your seat," Amelia called as Clayton led the pony around for another circuit. "Born to the saddle." Clayton grinned up at her, his face more weathered now but still handsome, still capable of making her heart skip a beat even after years of marriage. "And your fearlessness," he replied. "Haven't heard a single complaint about being up so high." As she watched her husband and son together, Amelia reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. The shadows of the past, Holloway's machinations, the desperate flight from his men, even the grief of losing her father had receded, replaced by the warm, steady glow of the life she and Clayton had built together. Jasper Holloway had died in prison 2 years earlier, unrepentant to the end. The news had barely rippled through their lives, a footnote rather than a defining event. They had moved beyond him, beyond the fear and uncertainty he had once represented. Later that evening, with the children asleep and the ranch settled for the night, Amelia and Clayton sat together on the veranda swing, a tradition they had maintained since their first year of marriage. The October air held a pleasant chill that provided an excuse to sit close, sharing a blanket across their laps. "I had a letter from Jones today," Clayton mentioned, his arm comfortable around her shoulders. "He's finally retiring. Wants to know if we'd consider taking on his nephew as our legal counsel." "The one from Boston who visited last spring?" Amelia asked. "He seemed capable enough, though I doubt Laredo will offer him much excitement after an Eastern practice." Clayton chuckled. "Jones said the same. But apparently the young man developed a fondness for Texas, or perhaps for Elena Jimenez. I noticed he paid her particular attention during his visit." "Mr. Jimenez would approve," Amelia mused. "He's been hoping to see Elena settled with a respectable husband." "Speaking of settling," Clayton said, his tone shifting to something more serious, "I've been thinking about that parcel to the east, the Matthews place. What about it? Old man Matthews is looking to sell. His children have all moved to California, and he wants to join them before winter sets in." Clayton hesitated, then continued. "I was thinking we might purchase it, not just for additional grazing but for Thomas and Elizabeth's future." Amelia smiled, touched by his forethought. "Always planning ahead, aren't you?" "I want to make sure they have options," Clayton explained. "If Thomas decides ranching is his calling, there will be enough land for both our children to have their own spreads one day, and if not," he shrugged, "it's still a sound investment." "You're a good father," Amelia said softly, resting her head on his shoulder, "and an excellent husband." "I had a fine example in your father," Clayton replied. "He built something lasting here. We're just continuing his legacy, making it our own." They sat in silence for a time, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods, the occasional hoot of an owl hunting in the darkness. "You ever think about that day?" Amelia asked suddenly. "When you stood on the tracks?" Clayton was quiet for a moment, his hand absently stroking her shoulder. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Not the danger of it that never really registered, just the certainty I felt. I knew I couldn't let that train take you away." "You barely knew me," Amelia reminded him. "I knew enough," Clayton said simply, echoing words he had spoken to her that very first day. "Some things you just feel in your bones, Standing on those tracks was the easiest decision I ever made." Amelia raised her face to his, still marveling after all these years at the depth of feeling she saw in his eyes when he looked at her. "I love you, Clayton Wilson, more than I ever thought possible." "And I love you, Amelia Wilson," he replied, lowering his mouth to hers for a kiss that, even after years of marriage and 2 children, still held the tender passion of new discovery. As the stars wheeled overhead and the ranch slept peacefully around them, Amelia knew with absolute certainty that the journey begun that day at the train station had led exactly where they were meant to be together, building a life rich in love and purpose, creating a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. From the moment Clayton Wilson had stood defiantly on those tracks, refusing to let Jasper Holloway's cruelty determine her fate, their paths had been irrevocably joined. What had begun in crisis had blossomed into a love story written across the Texas landscape. They both cherished a story of courage, perseverance, and the kind of devotion that could indeed stop a train in its tracks. And in the years to come, as their children grew and the Wilson Patterson ranch flourished, the tale of how they met would become family legend, a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of bravery are performed not for glory or gain, but for love.